Thank you so much. And yeah, welcome to this discussion today. I think we're gonna, be able to have a nice, fruitful conversation just about some of the basics and get into some of the deeper dives, and then we'll have some room for questions as well. And it'll be very conversational. And yes, so I'm Syrus, as you mentioned. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm actually coming to you from the little part of Toronto that is unceded territory, that is actually in the south part of the city that was underwater at the time of the Toronto Purchase and is therefore unceded. And according to Chief Stacey LaForme, the Mississaugas of the Credit is still their territory. And I'm honored to be able to live here and to work here and to do organizing and struggle work because the movement for Black Lives is intimately connected with the movement for Indigenous resurgence. So thank you for that introduction and for the land acknowledgement. Chanelle, do you want to say anything as part of introductions before we dive into the agenda?
Maybe I'll just say that. So I'm also, thank you so much for that introduction, Sri. That was really beautiful to hear about your own relationship to land and your own commitment to land through your children as well, and to Indigenous sovereignty. So I'm not sure what I have to add to that right now. Just that, I've been an organizer here in Toronto for about 20 years. I'm also a former sex worker, which is part of my journey to sex work activism. I am the eldest daughter of a poor white single mother. I'm a queer femme, and I'm a survivor of violence. And all of those play a role in the kind of work that I've done for the last 20 years, and the way that I understand systems of oppression to be deeply interconnected, and have sort of brought me toward a place of understanding our collective liberation. But we'll get into a little bit more about movements and nonprofits in the second half of this. So I'm just going to leave it there and pass it back to you, Syrus.
Thanks, Chanelle. And I apologize in advance if you hear a little bit of kid noise in the background. I'm parenting in a pandemic and I have an 8-year-old, so you might hear you might even see a little face just appear from the ether. So just bear with us. So yeah, we just wanted to sort of start by just sort of saying, of course, we know right now we are obviously in it. We are in a moment. We are in a moment that is a revolutionary moment. This movement for Black lives that we find ourselves in, this movement that is also nestled within a larger conversation around Indigenous resurgence, around disability justice, around mad justice. This movement is a long growing movement. Revolution is not a one-time event. It's a process. It's an ongoing process. It's a process that spans, often decades. I saw this beautiful poster going around this week that talked about mushrooms and mycelium, and how mycelium, the sort of underground part of the mushroom, spreads across this entire continent, in fact, across the entire world. There are mycelium networks that spread across, and that then every once in a while, there are these fruiting moments that come up from the mycelium, and that's what we know as mushrooms. And so they use that as an analogy to talk about revolution. In fact, revolution is part of these movements that spread across the globe, that every once in a while we see these fruiting moments. Well, right now we're in a part of a massive fruiting moment of this revolutionary period. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the history of the movement for Black life, which of course draws on and comes out of 500 years of resistance to the transatlantic slave trade, to the colonization of Turtle Island and Inuit Nunavut, and the sort of continued violence, colonial violence. People have been resisting on slave labor camps. People were resisting all throughout the Reconstruction period of Reconstruction in the 1920s, the 1930s, continuing through. We saw a lot of activism and organizing in the 1960s during the so-called civil rights movement, and of course continuing on through the 1970s. There's tons of Black, queer, and trans organizing here in the city of Toronto, and then continuing forward into what we now know as the sort of Black Lives Matter moment, where the movement is really focused on pushing for Black liberation, for racial justice, and for defunding the police. So why is this move? So this movement is a long movement. This movement, traces its legacy back to disabled Black heroes like Harriet Tubman, who participated in freeing hundreds, if not thousands, of Black people from slave labor camps, and who was brutalized on the slave labor camps, and as a result experienced disability. And it was this disability justice hero who ended up leading many of us to freedom. But just to clarify, of course, the Underground Railroad was a two-way transition, so that people actually came from the States up to Canada, so-called Canada, and often also came from Canada and went back to the States, or moved to the States because violence was bad here too, and there was slavery here too, and all of these sort of myths about Canada not being implicated in the slave labor trade is a fallacy. And so, of course, the Underground Railroad was a two-way road. So anyways, Harriet Tubman is one of the people upon whose shoulders we are standing. Also, historical figures like Marsha P. Johnson, a Black trans woman activist, some of the Black trans women and Latinx trans women who were involved in the Compton cafeteria riots in 1966 in Oakland. There are all of these, heroes who have really pushed for this movement, so that when we get to 2015, when Trayvon Martin, the verdict after Trayvon Martin's killing and the Zimmerman verdict in 2013 or 2014, and we get to this moment in 2015 where Black Lives Matter is really popping off and growing, we know that it is actually just the part of that fruiting mycelium of a much larger network of activist organizing that spans back generations, that spans back 2 or 3 generations of people fighting in order for their children to be free, in order for their grandchildren to be free. And that is a fight that we continue through the Black Lives Matter movement. So this movement is absolutely concentrated on this idea of ending police and prison violence in Turtle Island and Inuit Nunavut. So what we know is that we're told that the police are meant to provide safety and security to our communities. That's the story, right? That's the myth of the police system and the prison system. But we know if you do any research, or if you are racialized, if you are disabled, if you are trans, if you've ever had an experience with the police, you know that that is a fallacy. We know that the police have always served another function on this continent and in the world. On this continent in particular, they've always served the function of disappearing Black and Indigenous people from our communities, of ensuring that people who are most marginalized are disappeared and disenfranchised from our communities and removed. So the police have systematically inflicted violence against Black and Indigenous people across the continent. The early police force, the RCMP, was specifically set up to clear the land of Indigenous people, to stop Black people fleeing and trying to get emancipation, fleeing from slavery, and in order to keep those bodies removed eventually through the prison system, which was then eventually created. So the origins of the police and prison system in North America absolutely have everything to do with trying to control Black and Indigenous bodies. And so that's why it is such a hot button issue within both the movement for Indigenous resurgence and the movement for Black lives to talk about defunding the police. Because of course we know that we will never have liberation, we will never have freedom with this violent force that is specifically set out to do exactly what it is doing. It is not a broken system, it is working exactly as it is intended to. It is intended to particularly create violence for Black and Indigenous people. If anybody wants to do further reading on that history and on some of those origins, you can check out the incredible dissertation by Dr. Tiffany King, and it's beautifully written. It's not heavily academic. It's a very accessible document, but I'll post the link in the chat. But in that document, she talks about this concept of fungibility. And you might know the frame of fungibility if you're a gardener. You might know the phrase fungibility if you're in sort of management and sort of HR. Fungibility is this idea of being disposable, that something is inherently disposable or replaceable by another seed, for example. So she talks about how Black bodies were used as seeds to terraform the land, to change what was happening here, to terraform the land, in particular to disenfranchise and dispossess the land from Indigenous peoples, and how Black bodies were used as the conceptual fodder to make the master rich and to fuel settler expansion, right? So this concept of fungibility is really useful to help us understand why there's been such a disregard for Black life and for Indigenous life on Turtle Island. And the police are absolutely part of that process of fungibility and of making sure that we are seen as replaceable seeds ready to be planted, not actually as human beings and as if our lives don't matter. So of course, when we talk about defunding the police in 2020, people might think, well, where is this coming from? Or this seems like such a big idea. Couldn't we just try reform? What are you going to do if you don't have police? What are you going to do if you don't have prisons? How will we resolve conflict? How will we resolve harm? How will we resolve crisis? Well, the reality is that, as I mentioned, the police and prison system are working exactly as they are intended, and therefore they are not broken, and so they cannot be fixed. So this idea of reform just does not work. You can't reform a system that is doing exactly what it is intended to do. So various jurisdictions have tried reform. They've tried training, they've tried body cameras, they've tried all sorts of things to try to hold police accountable, but none of these measures have worked. Police keep killing Black people, they keep killing Mad people, they keep killing Indigenous people without ever having to be held accountable. So right now, the only solution that we can think of, the only way that we can actually move forward with any sense of human dignity at the moment on this planet is to put all of our efforts into defunding this violent force that has been brutalizing us for 500 years. So the police budget, is almost half of the city budget. They have this huge bloated budget, 90% of which goes to salaries. And they constantly are getting increases for things that should already be covered by their budget. So anytime they need more training, if we need to have body cameras just to stop them from beating the shit out of us, that's the only reason why we're putting body cameras on them, is because they keep brutalizing us over and over again. And the only solution we seem to have is that maybe we'll just try filming them do it. But that's a whole that's an aside. But these body cameras, of course, are increases to the police budget. So anytime you hear someone suggesting these reformist strategies, oh, we just need more training, oh, we just need body cameras, these are actually ways of increasing the police budget, this already bloated budget that is specifically going to salaries. So when you look at the activities of the police, we can realize that they are absolutely a violent force, and they need to be abolished. However, I've been teaching a class on prison abolition for a couple of years, a PhD level class at York University, and I've been an abolitionist for 25 years. I've been organizing since 1996, doing abolition work here in Takaranto and also in Vancouver, in Musqueam-Tsleil-Waututh territory. And one of the things that always happens as soon as you start to go to a conversation about what would it look like in a world without police and prisons, people immediately say, but what about, right? That's the phrase that will immediately come to me. But what about the really bad people? But what about sexual violence? But what about if your house is robbed? But what about, as if the police were ever helpful in those scenarios or situations, as if the police ever helped us in situations where there was crisis, conflict, or harm. So the police actually don't do any of those things particularly well, and they haven't done anything particularly well. So first of all, this myth of the dangerous few. And again, you can look at the incredible work of Dr. Vivian Salahana. Just 1 minute, please. my daughter's asking me for something in her bath. But yeah, if you look at the incredible work of Dr. Vivian Salahana, who's an activist, a longtime abolitionist, who's now based out of Rhode Island, but was working for many years in the prisons and institutions in Kingston, doing community work and community-based support work, she talks about this idea of the dangerous few and how it is a myth. This idea that prisons are full of serial killers, of people who perpetuate sexual violence, and that's who's making up our prison system. The reality is the majority of people who go to prison in Canada go to prison for things that are related to money, that are related to drugs and drug use, or that are related to bylaw infractions, or like small, like breaking ticketing infractions that people don't have the money to pay the bail to get out for. So the majority of people who are in prison in Canada are not in prison for violent things. They're not in prison for things that have actually resulted in harm to another person. They're in prison for things that are criminalized behaviors that are just part of living life. Not having enough to survive, not having enough resources to survive, using drugs, being HIV positive, being a sex worker. These are all criminalized behaviors, right? So the majority of people who are in prison in Canada are not this so-called dangerous few that we supposedly are keeping the prisons open to save us from. So that's the first myth. The second myth is this idea that the police are doing anything, or that prisons are doing anything to actually resolve the conflict and harm. So in that example, but Syrus, but what about, what happens, if your house is robbed? Well, if my house is robbed, the police are not going to do a particularly good job at solving that. If you've ever been robbed, if you've ever had your house burgled, you know that the police, do they come to you and say, we found the guy? Oh my God, we spent 2 years and we didn't stop until we found the person who stole your TV. Right. That does not happen. The TV shows that we've been watching for 3 decades, which are propaganda, cop shows have made us think that there is an unlimited budget to solve every crime, and that they're working around the clock nonstop to just make sure that they get that last eraser that was taken from your pencil case. That is not true. That is not what happens. I had a situation where in my life, more than one person was murdered. And even in a case of a murder, they use up the budget for investigation, usually within the first 3 months. And when that budget is spent, there is no more investigation. They will not do any more to solve the crime. This is why there are so many cases that are unsolved. So they're not even particularly good in those situations. In the case of my house being burgled, the person who's going to help me most likely is my insurance company. They're probably going to be much more helpful than the police. In the case of sexual violence, for people who believe in this idea of sort of a carceral feminist idea that we need police and prisons in order to stop sexual violence. Well, first of all, the police are perpetrators of sexual violence. There are countless examples of people speaking out about sexual violence at the hands of police officers. We know that people don't feel safe going to the police when they actually experience sexual violence because of the systemic sexism and misogyny that is built into the police force, and the way that victims of sexual violence are treated within the police force. So people don't report, they underreport. And then even for the folks who do report, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of untested rape kits sitting there that they are not doing anything with because it's not a priority. They are not actually working to make sure that people are safe from those kinds of harm and those kinds of conflict. If you think about emotional distress and crisis, okay, well, maybe we need police to, what if people are in emotional distress and crisis? We need someone to arrive. The police arrive. Well, if people in emotional distress or crisis don't need police officers arriving with weapons and uniforms who always escalate a situation. When you look at the experiences of people who are experiencing emotional distress or crisis, when the police arrive, it almost always raises the temperature in the room. It escalates things. And then, of course, what we see with mad people over and over again is that the police are so terrified, they're so sanist, they're so afraid of madness, as we are largely in society because we live in a sanist world that doesn't see madness as inherently valuable or inherently desirable. I'm a mad person. I think that our lives are valuable and that we should deserve to live. But when the police arrive in a situation where there is someone who is in emotional distress, it regularly results in a fatality. It regularly results in a fatality. It is no longer erroneous data. It is absolutely a consistent pattern where when they arrive, even the officers who are trained. So in the case of Andrew Loku, who was killed within 12 seconds of the police arriving at his building, the police who arrived had been trained extensively in de-escalation strategies, working with people in emotional distress. And one of the officers was training the other one. It was a training shift on how to do de-escalation. And when arriving at Andrew Loku's building and seeing him behaving in ways that were quote unquote unexpected in public space, which is what is always said about mad people, he was shot within 12 seconds. So even in the situation where they've had the training, they don't do any of these jobs particularly well. So what I'm trying to show is that the things that we think that they do, they don't do. They don't do. So why are we keeping them at this huge astronomical sort of budgetary, sinker on I mean, the mayor is saying right now, I don't know how I'm going to pay for things like childcare and libraries, but sure, let's give more money to police body cameras just to stop them from brutalizing us. So we realize that, anyways, I can go on. The police are not doing a particularly good job at any of these things. So what we're saying right now is that Black people, Indigenous people, mad people, trans people, sex workers, HIV positive people, and drug users all are at danger because of this force that is roaming the streets, that is specifically actively out there trying to remove the most marginalized people from our communities. And the only way forward that we can sort of see a way out of this is by actually defunding the police. Defunding the police, abolishing prisons, You know, prisons are a thing that, again, is just for all the people who aren't killed by the police. There are hundreds of others, thousands of others who are taken into custody, who are also disappeared from our communities, who are removed from our societies, and in order supposedly to keep us safe. And again, it is not keeping us safe. It is actually just removing our community members from our society. So this demand is present now. This demand is urgent now. We saw in the beginning of June the killing of George Floyd. That was an example where the police had body cameras and it didn't matter. We all got to watch, I didn't watch it, but we all had the opportunity of watching what is a glorified snuff film, watching the police murder somebody on camera. And the camera did nothing to actually increase the safety for George Floyd. Then we see the case of Regis Kosciuszki-Paquette here in Toronto, where this is somebody who called, whose family members called to try to get help for somebody who was in an emotional distress. And instead what ended up happening was, she ended up being killed by the police, off of her apartment balcony in High Park. So this is happening over and over and over again. And because we are in this moment, this revolutionary moment that I talked about at the beginning, this mycelium network that is fruiting and blooming into these beautiful mushrooms of change, because we are in a revolutionary moment, because we are already in a period of systems collapse, where capitalism is ending, where we're in that panarchy cycle of systems change. I teach systems thinking at BAM Center, and there's this cycle of systems change that is regular, that all systems seem to go through, where they go through periods of intense growth and expansion, and then periods of collapse. Because we're in a period of collapse right now, this is now the moment where there is a revolution that is happening. The ground is shifting beneath us. Every day that we wake up, things are a little bit further, a little bit closer to getting freer. So this movement for defunding the police is happening right now because people are saying, not one more life, no more deaths. We are saying enough of this, and we can win. We will win our liberation. And so ending the police and prison system in Canada is the goal, and we start with defunding. We move to disarming. We move to dismantling, and we abolish. We abolish and we end these systems, and we create alternatives. There are so many beautiful alternatives to policing. There are so many beautiful alternatives to prisons. There are ways that we can resolve conflict. There are ways that we can resolve crisis, and there are ways that we can respond to harm when it happens in our communities that are actually rooted in social justice, that are rooted in disability justice, that are rooted in care, that are rooted in mutual aid. We can take care of each other. We have taken care of each other, and we can do this without police and prisons. There are incredible resources out there. Everyday Abolition, I just want to give a shout out, which is a blog that Chanelle Gallant and oh my gosh, I'm forgetting your collaborator's name because I
Lisa
have a memory
Ellifere.
impairment, but thank you so much. That shows just everyday ways of living an abolitionist life. How do you live abolition in your everyday, from the ways that you resolve conflict in your home, the ways that you talk to your children, the ways that you live your life. There are great resources there. We at BLM, we made a website called Defund the Police. That's defundthepolice.org, and you can see alternatives to policing there as well. But I also just want to offer what Vivian Salahana sort of articulates, and she says that we don't actually need to have all of the alternatives sorted out in order to abolish the police and prisons. Because of course, what she's sort of saying is she conceptualized our relationship with the police as being an abusive relationship. We are in a violent relationship that has existed for 500 years, and we are trying to leave that relationship. And we are being told, tell me what you're going to do without us. How are you going to survive without our violence? How are you going to survive without our brutality? You'll never make it without us. That is essentially what we're being told when we're being forced to come up with a million alternatives to policing before we can even have a conversation about leaving this violent system that is brutalizing us. So she says we don't actually have to have all the solutions in order to know that the police are not working for us, in order to know that the prison system is violating us, in order to know that we need change. So, I'll just kind of wrap that section up there. That is a little bit about the movement for Black Lives and about the push for defund and why it is so present right now. We wanted to talk a little bit about what police abolition could look like within agencies. So of course, as we know, working in a nonprofit industrial complex, working in this sort of industry, there are all sorts of ways that we've built carceral logics, this idea of sort of being the police of our communities into our work. Everything from the way that we respond to crisis, conflict, and harm in our agencies, whether we have a policy on de-escalation, whether we call the police in situations, what do we do if people need to be quote unquote banned, which is a punitive carceral measure, so these carceral logics are built into the very nature of our work. And so when we talk about defunding the police, we have to think about what that would actually look like within our agencies. What would an agency-wide policy on alternatives to relying on the police to resolve conflict, crisis, and harm, what would that need to look like? Chanelle, did you want to jump in?
Sure, yeah. Wow, thank you so much for that, Syrus. Can you just show a little bit of love to Syrus? People want to either put something in the chat, do something visual. If you want to take yourself off mute and just like give some gratitude to Syrus. I don't want to jump into the next thing. Go ahead.
That was great. That was really informative. You packed in a whole bunch of information. It was really gripping, and I thank you for your knowledge and expertise.
Thank you so much. So funny, we're talking about the most important of things, and my daughter comes up and it's 10:30 and she's like, "Can I have an ice cream?" Like, what's happening? So I guess you still have real life at the same time as everything else. Sorry, Susie, were you going to say something?
Yeah, thank you for naming that the police system isn't broken, that it's functioning exactly the way it's meant to, because I think a lot of people don't. I think that's new information for a lot of people, and I think it's really important to remember or to know.
Yeah, it's a real radical reframing. I used to also be a reformist. When I started organizing 20 years ago, it was in response to a police raid on a women's bathhouse. The Toronto Women's Bathhouse Committee, we organized these women's bathhouses. I'm seeing some nods because I know there's some folks who remember those days. And so we were raided by the police, and we decided that what we would do was we would fight back. So we fought back against the charges, and we launched a human rights complaint against the police. And what we did in that human rights complaint was we demanded reforms to the police. We demanded things like, we wanted them to hire more LGBTQ officers. We wanted them to provide, across the board training to officers in, gay and lesbian sensitivity. We pushed for them the development of a policy on searching trans people, which at that point, there was no policy anywhere in North America in any police force on the methods police were supposed to use to search search trans people when they were detained. And we won those. We won those reforms. We won that the police had to develop a policy on how they were going to search trans people. We won one of the largest settlements in Canadian history against the police, which was, I think it was around $350,000, which was a huge settlement. We won sensitivity training, gay and lesbian sensitivity training, and we won that they should hire more officers from the gay and lesbian community. And what did it do? I come to you now 20 years later saying that was a mistake. It wasn't enough. We needed to push not for a better police force, but to be shrinking the police force, removing reducing their contact with community. That's what we actually needed. And so, part of my work now in support of abolishing the police is in accountability for the contribution that I and many other progressives made in actually expanding the legitimacy of the police force by arguing, well, they could just get better at policing, and expanding the budgets by injecting more money into things like training budgets. That's harmful. And I was deluded by a liberal left, a mainstream white-dominated liberal left that told me that this is what would be good for our communities. But actually, I come from a poor family with history in the drug trade and sex work. My people do not benefit from police either. At best, they do shit for us. That's the best it gets as poor white people. They'll leave us alone, but that means we're on our own. None of the resources and responses that we actually needed to deal with violence in my own family were available to us because all of that money and all of that energy was being poured into a police force and prisons, which did nothing for us. So there we were on our own, women surviving domestic violence, children surviving sexual abuse, adults surviving poverty, being on welfare. And what did we have? We didn't have enough to eat, but the city had enough money to pay for these bloated police budgets. So you see, I see this as being intimately connected. My experience being coming from a poor white family and the liberation of Black folks who are pushing for the changes we all need that will free us all. If Black people had what they had been demanding for decades, which is to defund the police and to develop resources that actually address crisis, conflict, and harm, my family would have had what we needed. We would have had enough. There would have been some real systems in place to protect us from violence. And instead, we were on our own, which was not good enough. So I want to transition to talking about agencies. You see, I was brought into this progressive movement that said, well, Chanelle, this is how we solve those problems. We make the police better. And this is what many of us who are in nonprofits are trying to do, make the world better, right? So the function of this talk today is, well, how can agencies be allies? And I want to talk about allyship to movements, allyship to social justice movements, and why we ally to social justice movements. But I want to make sure that I'm speaking to the real questions on this call. So I'd love to hear if people want to put some questions in the chat, and I'll start to kind of, as I can, rollingly. I know we have a Q&A, but it helps me just kind of keep touch with, matching like where people are at and what I'm speaking to. So please drop your questions in the Q&A. Yes, so someone mentioning how the officers that are recruited from marginalized communities, including queer people, are then subject to all kinds of abuse within the police force. So, okay, I want to talk a little bit about nonprofits and movement building. Okay, so agencies, the most powerful way that agencies can contribute to progressive social change is by explicitly allying to social justice movements that are led by the people who are most directly impacted by an issue. And this is not what we've been taught to believe is the source of social change, right? We're told that it's through, for example, elections, the people who hold elected office, and I do believe we have to impact the electoral arena, but movements come from people. Like change comes from mass movements of people who are organized around the issues that affect them. And so the most powerful work that agencies can do, I think, is to ally themselves with those movements. So for example, I used to work at an organization called Maggie's, which is a sex workers resource begun in the 90s. And Maggie's work was to support the lives of sex workers and to support them in winning control over their own lives and their destinies. So most people think, oh, well, you work with sex workers, that means that you provide them with sexual health resources, right? Because most people are kind of obsessed with the sexuality aspect of sex work. But in fact, what we know from sex work movements is that the primary need of sex work is decriminalization of sex work. Sex workers need, yes, of course, need all kinds of other support, but the reason they need support at root is the criminalization of their work and of their lives and the communities they come from. Because actually quite a wide range of people are criminalized for sex work, whether or not they're sex workers or not. They're profiled as sex workers, such as trans women of color. So when we follow movements, our work looks really different. It goes from, okay, we're gonna provide this drop-in, but it also includes, we're gonna support the advocacy to decriminalize sex work. And so, there's one thing I really wanna, if there's one thing I really wanna communicate to folks in this talk, and and that I hope people take from this, is for agencies to get much more clear about your stance in relation to the political root causes of the issues that your agency is addressing. If there is no agency that is dealing with issues that are unrelated to poverty, I can just throw that out there pretty generally. Every agency is addressing the impacts of poverty. What is your agency doing at an agency level and a sectoral level to address and reduce and ultimately eliminate poverty? And for that, you have to look at, well, what are social justice movements doing about poverty, led by poor people? What are organized poor people telling us they need to address poverty? So that might look like, for example, support for a universal basic income, right? And this is where we get into the problems of the nonprofit industrial complex. So there are limits on what agencies can do, right? Agencies can only perform no more than 10% of their funding can go toward political advocacy, political activities. Those rules were introduced by Harper specifically to surveil, harass, attack, chill, and close down organizations whose work was really a threat to the resource extraction sector. Because that, you know, the Harper government and most Canadian governments are really in bed with the corporate mining companies and the resource extraction companies more generally, the oil and gas sector, et cetera. But those rules must be resisted. And they've since been clarified a little bit more by the Trudeau government. So from what I understand, find out what are the limits actually. Don't just accept them. How much political advocacy can you do? If you want to understand, when I'm talking about the nonprofit industrial complex, I realize I just threw that out there. But what I mean by that, by the nonprofit industrial complex, let me see if I've got, I think I've got a little definition, a sort of basic definition. Essentially, it's state and corporate control over left and progressive movements. So agencies, you know, all of you, if you're serving community in various ways, you see that there are some structural issues. There are structural issues. What can your why is your agency limited in addressing those? Why isn't the agency specifically and explicitly dealing with the harm of police, the violence of poverty? Someone put in the chat, we can do 100% as long as it's linked to our charitable objects. Yes, so I think there's a lot of misunderstanding and fear about how much political work charities can do. And it's on you to find that out. Sometimes that means working with a charity lawyer. Find out how much political work can you do and then push it to the limit. Do the most you can do. Do political work. And I was so encouraged to see, for example, the Toronto Neighborhood Centre's letter in support of defunding the police. That's what we mean. Some organizations, I mean, I've had organizations tell me they're afraid to sign a petition, let alone come out with a statement like that. There's a chill on political activity. We might lose our money. That's what they're intending. That's the point of the nonprofit industrial complex, is to scare organizations into actually dealing, frontline organizations get scared off of dealing with the root causes of the issues that their clients face every day. Yeah, so somebody also mentioning in the comment about how we have progressive politicians get elected and then very little change happens. And we spend too much time on this on elections. I think elections are complex. I mean, the things I want to say about elections are, no, the progressive social movements are not political parties. That is not where that is not the location of social justice movements. However, we cannot cede elections. We cannot step out of that venue at all. Otherwise, what we see is that the right wing, and in the US, India, many places in the world, we can see that the very hard right has their eyes on the highest elected offices and fights to win them, and then can do incredible damage from those places. So it's not that we see radical or revolutionary change come from office. It's that we try to get in the best enemy. Who is the most movable progressive enemy we can get in? So if we had highly progressive politicians in City Hall, they're not going to be where the radical change comes from. It comes from the ground, but they're more movable. They're more amenable to the push from community. So the ideas, that I'm bringing today, I want to credit a little bit. So this idea that the nonprofit system is set up to actually manage and limit dissent is intentional, just like with the police, what Syrus was saying, it's not broken. So the fact that charities you can provide services to poor people, but you can't seem to really actually do anything to end poverty, that's intentional. That's by design. That's called the nonprofit industrial complex. And the ideas behind that come from radical women of color, an organization called Insight, Women of Color Against Violence, published this book, which I highly recommend, which is called The Revolution Will Not Be Funded: Beyond the Nonprofit Industrial Complex, where they talk about how they're stuck in these situations where they're working for these really great progressive nonprofits, but they somehow can't seem to really do the work they know they need to do to end the problems they're facing without losing funding. So, yes, Insight, Women of Color Against Violence is the editor of this book, and I also recommend their first book, which is just called The Color of Violence, which is their first book. I brought out my little library. I don't normally do this, but but I was looking for something, and I thought these books will be perfect. So when I talk about social movements, that all change comes from social movements. Well, that comes from the Black radical tradition too. And I want to lift up Ella Baker and the Black freedom movement, a radical democratic vision. So what I'm talking about is radical democracy. Where does the idea that change comes from radical democracy, where does that come from? And I remember years ago reading some Martin Luther King essays, and in it he talked about direct action. And I was shocked because I had never heard that the concept of direct action came out of the civil rights movement. It had always been taught to me, really, that it was sort of, black bloc, white anarchists. But actually this idea that where really radical change is coming from is it's coming from the most directly impacted people, right? Full disclosure. And so I actually had all of these ideas from the kind of white liberal left that slowly I started to understand much more broadly where real change was coming from, and where we needed to take leadership from, direction from, and it's the most directly impacted people. So if we want to understand poverty, we have to look at, well, who's the most directly impacted by poverty? What are they saying they need? And how can agencies ally with them? And maybe that's a statement, but sometimes it's more. When I look at the HIV/AIDS Legal Network and the work that they've done around harm reduction in prisons, or the criminalization of HIV, actually, they're pushing it. They're pushing to deal with, they're pushing to deal with the root causes, the policy work that agencies need to be doing in order to really be accountable to the communities that you serve. And I think I'm just going to pause it there.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. That's just so brilliant. And I'm sorry that I laughed out loud when you said that direct action came from the...
Oh no, it's laughable. That's an invitation for humor. It's funny.
Yeah, it was... Oh, hold on. Why is my daughter calling me when she's in the next room? Yeah, yeah, thank you so much, Chanelle. So then this question of like, Amelie, if you need me, just come and get me, okay? Yeah, this question then, I want to just turn us back to, what does that mean then? I think you've pointed to this idea that you actually could be advocates, that you could push this envelope to the nth degree, to the edge, up to the very edge. And I want to talk a little bit about your role, because of course all of you all of you have the possibility to participate in actually dramatically changing the world right now. We are in a moment where everybody has the possibility of dramatically changing the world right now. So this idea, that people talk about where they say, oh, what would I have been doing during the civil rights movement? Would I have been marching with Martin Luther King, or would I have been at home? What would I have been doing? Well, this is the moment, folks. This is the moment right now to say, what would I be doing in moments where profound change is necessary? And profound change is necessary right now. And you have the possibility of making changes, even from within, from your desk, from your home, from wherever you are doing your work at this current moment. You have the possibility of making dramatic change. So thinking about within your area of scope, within your organization, what is it that you can influence in terms of policy? What is it you can influence in terms of strategy for how you're going to resolve conflict, crisis, and harm? And do some important, those books that Chanelle raised up are incredible resources, and just really read through and think through, what can I personally do that will dramatically increase the safety of the folks who are most marginalized, the folks who are coming to our services because this is the last stop where we really need these resources. The nonprofit industrial complex, as Chanelle mentioned, is the system has really tried to hamper community-led organizing through, and really tried to prevent it through all of those strategies. So, I think back to my time. I worked for many years at PASAN, which is the Prisoners HIV and AIDS Support Action Network. And they do work specifically with prisoners and ex-prisoners who are HIV positive or co-infected with hepatitis C. And we had really spicy moments. Things happened there that were complicated and that were hard, and that resulted, in us having to make really difficult decisions about how we were going to keep each other safe. So if a client came back and was really mad, there were situations where, in the most extreme example, somebody came with a weapon to the office, and we had to decide how we were going to resolve that problem in that moment without calling the police, because of course, if you call the police to an agency full of prisoners and ex-prisoners, that is a terrible idea, because of course everybody will then be picked up for, just associating with other people who have charges. So, that was not an option. So we had to come up with strategies, even in the most extreme examples, of how we were going to keep each other safe. And I think that that's part of, doing that work before the person is at the door with a weapon, doing that work now so that you're planning and preparing for how you will, the reality is that that's probably not the most common conflict that you're going to have. It's going to be sort of interpersonal conflicts and how you're going to resolve things if they escalate a little bit, or if there's a fist fight or something sort of, I'm going to call that kind of smaller scale. I'm not, you have to figure out how you're going to resolve those things before they happen. And so thinking through building some capacity, amongst the people that you're working with to be able to resolve conflict, to be able to address harm as it happens, and to be able to respond to crisis is going to be so essential. And I know, Chanelle, you worked at several organizations as well. And, similarly, I know we had a chance to talk a little bit before about how do you do that, without resorting to carceral logics, banning people or calling police, or, how do you actually resolve, conflict, crisis, and harm when it comes to our doorstep of our agency?
Yeah, there's two things I want to lift up. One is a project that came out of Rittenhouse years ago, which was a transformative justice harm reduction project that worked on training, in particular, drug-using members of community centers, like who were accessing community centers, on de-escalation and conflict resolution, so that they would reduce the incidence of being banned. Because being banned is dangerous and harmful practice for people whose survival depends on who don't get their basic needs met if they aren't able to access services. So that was a project that is exactly what Syrus was talking about. That looked at beforehand what kinds of training and systems and policies do we need in place so that all of our members are actually already prepared to intervene in and respond to conflict and harm before it escalates.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say that's so crucial that it can't just be, we do this work where we do training for the staff. That's such a model. That's where you train the staff, where you don't train any of the membership. You don't train you don't actually do like a holistic approach where everybody who's using the space is treated is equally entitled to the same information, to be able to do the job well, to be able to respond well, to be able to care for each other well. Instead, the way that the nonprofit industrial complex is sort of predicated, that the training just goes to the people who have the steepest hierarchy roles, you know, the sort of staff or the agency leads, and the actual people who are probably using the space more and in the space more don't get access to that training. So it's absolutely essential that the resources and the support and the planning involve the membership, because if you're not doing that, you're missing a huge, I mean, that's the majority of people in the space. You know, why would you only train 10% of the people who are using the space? That doesn't make sense, right? Sorry to interrupt, Chanelle.
Exactly. No, thank you for pointing that out. Yeah. I mean, that's what one of the things that was so radical about that model is that the people who are intervening in harm are their friends. The people who are doing the frontline harm reduction are other drug users. Like, it's like, that's who we need to actually be trained and equipped and allowed to intervene, right? Given the responsibility to intervene in conflict and harm. And that's not usually who we think of. And then when I was working at Maggie's sex workers organization, we had, I didn't realize it was unusual, but we had a policy that we would not, not only would we not call police, but we did not enforce criminal code prohibitions on drug use in the space. And we're explicit about that. We would not kick someone out for drug use. We would not call the police for drug use. We just would not enforce those rules. And I thought this was normal because this was obviously the safest thing to do. And then I was talking with someone who ran another drop-in, told me about somebody using drugs in the bathroom and then calling the police. And I just said, well, why did you do that? And I was sort of stunned. I couldn't, you know, and I realized that other people have a different relationship to rules. And thought, well, I have a responsibility to follow the rules. And I was like, but then, I mean, that's so dangerous for them. I mean, then you call the cops on someone who has drugs on them. I mean, that sounds really bad. How is that helping people? And so for me, part of it is just like a fundamental shift into who you trust, and trusting the people that you work with, trusting your community members more than you trust the rules that have been set by the elite, that are so removed from people's actual needs. And I really loved and respected that. I loved and respected that it was a space that not only was so supportive of drug users, but that taught me to have a lot, like how to have just more decency toward people who use drugs in a way that supported their dignity and their rights over their bodies and what they put in them. So,
and we've been made to believe that we are more at risk from our lived lives. We are more at risk from the drugs that we use. We are more at risk from the jobs that we take, and we're more at risk for our health status than we are from the police, which is such a fallacy. But we've been told that we are so at risk for our own behaviors that we need to be criminalized to keep us safe. So you call the police on the drug user in the bathroom, supposedly to help the drug user in the bathroom. But as you said, Chanelle, that's a terrible idea and does nothing but actually harm that person. But we've been told that we are more at risk from ourselves than we are from the police. And so the police come in these moments to somehow protect us from ourselves. That is the most paternalistic, the most obscene distortion of what is actually happening in this world. And I just, yeah. So I know time is a thing. I can't wait till after the revolution when we radically reimagine our relationship to time and to space and how we think about the way that we use time. I can't wait for that. But currently still technically under capitalism, so I suppose time is a thing that still exists. So I wanted to make sure that we had time for your questions. And so we wanted to turn it back to you to say, okay, well, given all of that, if we know that the police are not keeping our communities safer or more secure, if we know that prisons and disappearing people is not keeping our communities safer and more secure, and if we know that defunding the police is a strategy that people are calling for, not just from within Black and Indigenous communities, but literally from all over the planet, people are rising up, as Martin Luther King said, something is happening in this world. People are rising, the masses of people are rising up. The masses of people are rising up and saying, defund the police. They are making monuments and murals and posters that can literally be seen from space saying defund the police. So if that is true, if all of what we have said is true, what do we do differently on Monday morning as agency workers that will dramatically change, be participating in supporting that movement, supporting that call, and changing the reality for the people who we work for? So we want to turn it to you. What are your questions? What are the things that you're thinking about? What are you,